Okay, so Unit 5.1 Part 2 is going to begin with Proto-Industrialization. It actually goes by three names. You'll hear it Proto-Industrialization, or the cottage industry, or the putting out system. All of them stand for the same thing. Proto means before, so like as in a prototype. So Proto-Industrialization is going to be the industrialization prior to the Industrial Revolution. And it is a result of the agricultural revolution and some of the things that we just reviewed in part one. So the rural industry is going to become a major pillar of Europe's growing economy in the 18th century. The rural population, who we'd seen with the Enclosure Act, is being cut off from some rural production, is going to be eager to supplement their income. There's not a lot of agricultural work, so they're going to have to find other things to do in the countryside. Merchant capitalists or entrepreneurs in the cities were also eager to draw upon this cheap labor in the rural countryside rather than paying the guild members. Remember, guild we've talked about since the Middle Ages, in towns higher fees because they were like unions, so they didn't want to pay these people in the guilds in the cities who had these regulated wages. They went out, they're going to start seeking in the countryside knowing there's a labor force there that will work for cheaper. So thus early industrial production was put out into the countryside, hence the putting out system. They took the work from the cities, put it out in the countryside, equaling the putting out system in the countryside. It is a form of capitalism. You have an entrepreneur in the city who wants to make a product, who wants to make a profit, who is going to then find the cheapest labor so they can increase their profit. And manufacturing with hand tools and peasant cottages came to challenge the urban craft industry. So we're going to see the cottage industry will challenge the urban craft industry and make a shift that's going to lead us towards the Industrial Revolution. So the cottage industry, the same as proto-industrialization or the putting out industry, called this because it's the cottages in the countryside that we're going to send the work for. So these merchant capitalists in the city are going to provide raw materials, especially as we're going to be following raw wool from sheep, to a rural family in the countryside who will produce a finished or semi-finished product, such as a piece of cloth, and send it back to the merchant for payment. So it's kind of a piecing system, or a paying per piece. Therefore, cottage workers were usually paid by the number of pieces they produce, not per hour. So keep that in mind. Wool cloth being our number one product here. Merchants would then sell the finished product that the rural workers made for a profit. There's your capitalism again. And wool cloth was the most important product, especially in England. The cottage industry was essentially a family enterprise. So if you remember, we've been following the family. Women, children, father, all working together on the farm will now work together in this cottage industry. It took the work of 4 or 5 spinners, however, to keep one weaver steadily employed. So husband and wife would often have to try to find more thread and more spinners, and this is where we get kind of a cultural term applied to these women. Remember, women had lost some of their significance in the agricultural revolution, being put off the land and not having other work to do other than domestic jobs in the city. But those left in the rural community would become spinners. And then this is where the word spinster comes from. Not as popular in today's age, but a spinster meaning like, oh, was that old spinster ever going to get married? But they were unmarried women whose families needed them to earn an income to help support. Or were widows, and they would spin for a living because you needed so many more spinners than you did weavers, etc. Sometimes families would subcontract work to others, so like in one cottage they'd do this part and then they'd subcontract to another family. And we will see that even little kids played a part in this, so we still see the nuclear family like working together. We're going to see a change in this when we get to the real Industrial Revolution, but this is prior to. You'd have like little kids who clean the wool, like they'd be the agitators in little buckets of water, or even like dye the wool with color added, of course have colored feet for a while, but they would play their part. So problems with the cottage industry, however, is that we have constant disputes between cottagers and merchants over the weights of materials and quality of cloth. So like, let's say this merchant capitalist dropped off 50 pounds of wool, and I don't make cloth, but like, he gets 14 pieces of cloth back. He's like, wait, I brought 50 pounds. That's there's like this disconnect between what the expectation is and what the actual product is they get back. Then they'll be like, I'm not going to pay you. And so here these cottage people have done all of this work, and like, who has the upper hand in this situation? Of course, it's the entrepreneur, their superior. The rural labor was also unorganized and usually difficult for merchants to control because there was like no union protection, or like no, there's like really no way to organize all these little cottages. Like everyone agrees on a price, or this is how things are going to be done. And just like anywhere else, the villages there's a lot of ceremonies and weddings and celebrations, and so they'd be like, oh, I have like 3 months to get this done. They do all of these wedding seasons or parties, and just like human nature is, they would put off making the pieces until like 3 days before, and quality would suffer, and then the entrepreneur wouldn't want to pay for it. And so merchant capitalists, as a reaction to these disputes and these problems, are going to search for more efficient methods of production. And this is going to be profound in the resulting growth of factories in the Industrial Revolution. So these disputes in this early cottage industry are going to lead us into our Industrial Revolution in Unit 5.2. All of these people in separate cottages isn't working, but the entrepreneurs are going to say, what if we can pull all of these people in all these little separate cottages into one building? Example, a factory, and have them all work together. So we'll see this play out in the Industrial Revolution. So what are the results, however, of the putting out system? The results are thousands of poor rural families are able to supplement their incomes with the work in the putting out or cottage industry. And unregulated production in the countryside is going to result in experimentation and the diversification of goods. So we're going to see different products being made. Remember, we have people with some extra income now because there's enough food to buy consumer goods. So we're going to see goods like textiles, knives, forks, housewares, buttons, gloves, clocks, and musical instruments come into the marketplace. And that's going to set us up for our Industrial Revolution as well. The cottage industry is going to flourish first in England, because remember, that's where most of the enclosure acts were, where people were needing to supplement their income. Spinning and weaving of wool and cloth will become the most important. You need to know that. Spinning and weaving of wool and cloth. In 1500, half of England's textiles were produced in the countryside, and then by 1700, that percentage was higher. The putting out system in England will spread later to continental countries such as France and Germany. Remember, France is dealing with barricades and revolution right now, so they are not really thinking about industrialization, and Germany is not yet completely formed into an autonomous nation. So keep that in mind. Going to start in England and the lowlands, and then we'll see it move into the continental Europe. So let's talk about technology in proto-industrialization prior to the steam engine. When you get to the steam engine, that is when you know that we're in the Industrial Revolution. But let's talk about the engineering behind proto-industrialization. So I am not an engineer of textile technology, but what you really just need to know about this section is not about the engineering, but about the effect that this technology had on proto-industrialization. So you might get a question on an AP test such as, all of the following had an impact on proto-industrialization except. And so like, except the steam engine, because that's going to be in the Industrial Revolution. So our first, 1733, John Kay is going to invent the flying shuttle, which is going to enable weavers to throw the shuttle back and forth between threads with one hand. This, however, is going to make weaving go faster. Remember, you needed like 5 spinners to 1 weaver, so this is going to necessitate, just as technology always does, more innovation, because you're going to need more spinners, or a quicker spinning process to allow the spinners to keep up for the weavers. So that'll lead us into 1764 with James Hargreaves. And he will invent the spinning jenny, named after his daughter, I believe, which mechanized the spinning wheel. So that's going to mechanize the spinning process to allow the spinners to keep up with the weavers. And then, so we have human power right now. So you're using your feet and a pedal to do this. And then that's going to move us into then water power, which will be the end technology of proto-industrialization, leading us up to steam power. And so in 1769, Richard Arkwright is going to invent the water frame, which improved thread spinning, so another improvement on the spinning. In the 1780s, Arkwright will then use steam engine to power looms, which required factory production textiles. So he'll play a part in proto-industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. Many historians will consider this the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So Richard Arkwright and the use of steam engines. So the transformation from the water frame to the steam engine, some see as that like cut that date for the Industrial Revolution, and that's what we will use. Another water-powered source is going to be by Samuel Crompton in 1770. And this is going to be the spinning mule, which combined the best features of the spinning jenny and the water frame, so it puts it together. So you can start to see we're edging our way towards these big production machines that we'll start to see in the factory. And in fact, remember, this is all happening in little cottages. So as you need this bigger and bigger equipment, we're going to see the cottages are less and less efficient because you can't fit this stuff in there with the people that have to work, totally leading us towards factories in the Industrial Revolution as well. And that will take place once the use of steam power comes in. So let's go back and review some things that play a key part in proto-industrialization in this new economy. Most of this will be review. But just putting it into the context of the 18th century and really setting our stage and reviewing from first semester to prepare for second. Okay, so some reminders of the topics we've already discussed, but in the context of the 18th century and leading up into the Industrial Revolution. Mercantilism in the Atlantic economy, or commercial trade. We saw European maritime expansion in the 18th century. We've discussed it. We're going to review it here. World trade is going to become fundamental to the European economy. Sugar. You need to know sugar became the most important commodity produced in Atlantic trade. Sugar is going to lead to the necessity of slaves. It's a very laborious field, the production of sugar. But we will also see tobacco, cotton, and indigo also becoming important from North America, as well as spices. So you have three S's here: sugar, spices, slaves. The slave trade will become enormous. Spain and Portugal, as we've already studied, revitalized their empires and grew economically from renewed development. We saw that emerge in the 18th century. The Netherlands, Great Britain, and France, however, are going to benefit the most. And so seeing that along the way. By far, England as well will have the largest number of immigrants to the New World, to its colonies at this time. And so we'll see that just the impact on some of the nations we're going to be following the most closely because of world trade, especially England, France, and the Netherlands. So, of course, they're leading England and the Netherlands in the agricultural revolution and things, and that becomes a part of this, and then we'll see France kind of step up. So we've covered mercantilism already. This should go very quickly here. Main goal: economic self-sufficiency for a nation. A country or empire sought to create a favorable balance of trade by exporting more than it imported. Tariffs or custom duties were placed on imports to try to avoid importing. You don't want to put gold in someone else's treasury. Speaking of gold, then that brings us back to bullionism. So bullionism going hand in hand with mercantilism that we've talked about. Countries sought to build up large reserves of gold and silver and then thus prevent the flow of these precious metals out of their country. You don't want it in someone else's treasury. And then this becomes the purpose of world trade. This is what the purpose of colonies are, and our purpose for discussing colonies here in the 18th century. Colonies were thus acquired to provide raw materials and markets for their mother country. Their sole purpose, colonies, were to serve the mother country. States are going to grant monopolies to large companies. Examples are the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company we've talked about, and also encourage development of domestic industry so that a country would not have to buy a finished product from a rival country. So we start to see these colonies' main purpose is to serve their mother nation so that their mother nation doesn't have to put gold in any other nation's treasury. So just a review there. And so now we're going to discuss Great Britain and its role. So in the 17th century, we really followed the Dutch in its golden age, but now Great Britain in the 18th century, because of world trade, is going to become the world's leading maritime power. There's a couple reasons why this is able to happen. A lot to do with entrepreneurship and capital. England has the Bank of England that was developed in 1694, which provided an important source of capital for economic development, capital for entrepreneurs, capital for people willing to take a risk, to make an investment. We also saw the Act of Union in 1707 that we discussed, which unified England and Scotland, because the Scots, which we'd seen fighting for independence, finally realized that the benefits of the economy outweigh the negatives of being bound with England, and so they seek the benefits of trade within the English Empire. Just a side note, with the Act of Union, you can see the flag of Scotland, which was the cross of St. Andrew, and then the flag of England, which had been the cross of St. George, combined. And then we'll add, some more stripes, of course, as United Nations combine even further, but the Union Jack will be made, and then that will eventually make the modern-day flag of Great Britain. We'll see that British mercantilism differed from France and that government economic regulations often served the private interest of individuals and groups as well as public needs of state. And we discussed that, that some of the problems that France faced as we just finished the French Revolution is that an authoritarian state like France sought an economic system that primarily benefited the state rather than businessmen and workers. And that's where we saw that intendant system in France, which led us to the French Revolution. So different mercantilism in Britain allows for business owners, for entrepreneurs to benefit. We saw the Navigation Acts, and we talked about that beginning back with Oliver Cromwell, that were passed by Parliament to increase military power and private wealth in England. So another thing that helps increase private entrepreneurship. The first acts were passed in 1651 and sought to reduce Dutch domination of Atlantic trade. So that's where we saw, the Dutch kind of decline and the English step up. It required that most goods imported from Europe into Great Britain be carried on British-owned ships with British crews or on ships of the country producing the specific good. And so this is, of course, British ships, British goods, British money, keeping the money there. It gave British merchants and ship owners virtual monopoly on trade with the colonies. This is like 100 years before the American Revolution, but it's something that really kind of ticks us off as British colonists, because the colonists were required to ship their products, like our sugar, our tobacco, our cotton, on British ships, and to buy almost all of our European goods from Britain. So here we are giving, and where should the money we think stay? Should stay here. It's going to Britain, and not only that, we're having to spend money on goods. And so this is something that, you saw in U.S. History, hopefully. What's going to be coming up next, the Navigation Acts being something stuck in the craw of the American colonists. Okay, so let's talk about the ships, these ships with the goods. No empty ships on the Atlantic with triangular trade. Okay, so you should remember triangular trade from like the 8th grade. Pretty much the concept is you should have no empty ships. Like, you don't want to spend the money for a crew and a ship to be empty. It revolved around the West Indies and the Caribbean and included North America and Africa. So there's a couple scenarios of, how British ships would fulfill this. There's you could send a ship full of slaves from Africa to then the West Indies or the Caribbean, where you would then trade those slaves for sugar. And then you'd have the boat full of sugar. And then the sugar would go to the colonies. And there you'd have the colonies produce rum. And then you would have that ship filled with rum, maybe go back to Africa and trade for people, for more slaves. And so your ship is never empty. And it's also making you money all along its stop. So that's just the purpose of triangular trade, and one of the significant ways that Great Britain is able to usurp our Dutch Republic, which we're going to talk about right now, that it had its golden age in the first half of the 17th century. So reviewing our Dutch Republic here, we talked about all of this during the first half of the 17th century. The Netherlands was the world's dominant maritime power, the golden age of Netherlands that we talked about. The middle class or burghers had dominated politics and the economy. The government had remained decentralized. I hope you got that right in your test, and did not impede the economy. We have no monarch. There was a large degree of religious toleration. We've talked about all of this. But then what really happened, some things happened, that why we're talking about England now in the 18th century and the Dutch Republic was in the 17th century, is there's going to be 3 Anglo-Dutch wars. So the British and Dutch are actually going to go to wars between 1652 and 1674, and it will do damage to the Dutch shipping and trade. New Amsterdam will be seized by England in these wars in 1664 and renamed New York. So if you know anything about the price value of that land, I think the Dutch had got it for the trade of some just crazy, just tomahawks and things like that, like little weapons, and now it's been seized by England and becomes New York. I mean, you can almost say priceless land there. This is where England really becomes supreme. By the late 17th century, the Dutch were falling behind English in shipping, trade, and colonies. However, the English and Dutch are kind of what you would consider natural allies. Even though they have these struggles, they're going to come together to try to stop the expansion of Louis the 14th. You remember that with the wars with Louis the 14th, try to stop his expansionism in the late 17th century. The wars, however, of Louis XIV are going to further weaken Dutch trade in the Atlantic. Remember, we have William of Orange, who will then become the King of England. There for the Dutch, representing and being one of the main impediments of Louis XIV. but it does some damage to them. Not being a maritime power like England is going to become, they lose some things here, and so they're going to shift their attention to banking rather than trade and manage to survive intact. They're going to live off their interest, which is awesome. Like, I want to live off my interest. You guys can start an account. They're the first country to perfect the use of paper currency. The stock market in Amsterdam was the most important in Europe. They're going to create a central bank too, and they're going to survive, although they're not going to be our maritime power like they were. So if you get a question on the AP exam, the maritime power in the 17th century, Dutch. If it says 18th century, you're going to answer England. So let's talk about another reason that the British are able to become dominant in the 18th century. We talked a little bit about this, and that is the slave trade. The dramatic growth in the Atlantic trade was due in large part to the use of slave labor. We're going to see about 10 million Africans transported to the New World in the 17th and 18th centuries. Who has a lot of stake in the New World? That is the British. Half of the slave trade will occur aboard British ships, 25% on French ships, and the rest on Dutch, Portuguese, Danish, and American ships. So half of the slave trade occurred aboard British ships, and part of that is that asiento that they gained in the Treaty of Utrecht that we talked about. British and French governments gave chartered companies monopolies over the slave trade in the 17th and early 18th century, and we'll see the development of forts, slave forts or factories that were set up on the West African coast to oversee and protect the slave trade. So we'll see that, like we talked about the triangular trade here on the West Coast, so the boats can load up with individuals. There's like doors here, and it'd be called like your last exit, the last thing you saw, like you just go out through this door, and there is the water. There's where the ship would be docked right there. We'll see independent slave traders break the slave trade monopoly by the 1730s, but at its beginning, we have government chartered companies. Most slaves were actually captured by rival African tribes, so Africans who then traded the African slaves for European goods such as cloth, alcohol, and weapons. So most of the slaves that came from Africa came from the interior that were captured in warfare, led by other Africans. March, so this is the first trek of their journey, is a march to the West African coast to those slave factories or forts that we just looked at. And then that's where they would take the second part of their journey, which is called the Middle Passage. So the second part of their journey is the Middle Passage. It's that passage across the ocean. Between 20% and 1/3 of slaves died en route to the New World while on slave ships on the Middle Passage. And so they just overpiled them, expecting people to die along the way. I mean, horrible conditions. I think in Amistad that you saw, like they're just throwing the bodies over the ship as individuals die along the way. Most of these slaves that survived the Middle Passage were taken to Brazil or the West Indies, usually to work on sugar plantations. I remember a very laborious activity, the production of sugar. And so this is where predominantly our slaves will end up. As many as 400,000, however, will end up in British North America in the colonies here, such as Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. And this is where we are going to see a wealthy planter class begin. Our founding fathers, who, because they have all of these individuals to do work for them, will have time to do things like scheme against the British government, write a constitution, etc. It's at this time in our history that 20% of the population in the colonies was black. Was comprised of slaves coming across the Middle Passage. Now, today, I think we're around 13 to 14%, and that is just because we have had so many different ethnicities come in. We have a Latino population, we have all different forms of immigrants that came after that time, and so really at that time you just had the British colonists and you had slaves. So 13 to 14% now, down from the 20% at this time period. The slave trade, however, will dwindle significantly by the 1780s because of the subsequent increase in New World slave population is actually going to come from natural population. You have all 20% of the population, they're going to reproduce themselves here, and so that will dramatically slow down the slave trade. And then in 1807, second semester, we're going to see the abolishment of slavery in the British Empire. I think there's a really good movie. I think it's called Amazing Grace. It's a movie that we may incorporate into second semester about the abolishment of slavery in the British Empire. Okay, now let's talk some more about economy in the 18th century and some problems with economy that we're going to see. So, the bubbles. Both Britain and France are going to, as we've discussed, face massive national debts due to the numerous wars fought that we've covered in the 17th century and early 18th centuries, and these are going to create these things called bubbles. So I think the easiest way to explain it is to use like a real world example, and then we can go through the bubbles that happened here. So like in 2002, if you bought a house, the value of that house, you bought it, let's say it's worth $100,000, then a 2004, 2005, the value's gone up. Now it's worth 280,000. And you're like, oh, and money's really easy to borrow. And like you can just go into a bank and like you don't have to like boop, you have a loan, boop, you have a loan. And so people start to go, hey, like look, like I didn't even have to do anything. I lived in this house for a year. The value went up $180,000. They're going to start to buy houses they can't afford in the hopes to then turn around and sell them for a huge profit. Or they buy second homes that they can't afford, hoping to sell them. And then people like, look, I didn't do anything and I made $180,000. And everyone's doing it. And then, you know, the value keeps going up and up on the homes until someone realizes, like, hey, I don't think this home is worth this. And then, you know, the market's saturated and everyone's selling, and then the price goes way down, and then boom, it pops. And the prices that have been escalating go way down because everyone is selling. And there is this need for a house. And so it creates this bubble and then it bursts. And so that's what a bubble is. It's when it's like everything's going well. So like who this would have really affected is people that maybe bought a house around like 2008 and now the value of their home is way lower than the value at which they bought it because the bubble burst, and now they're having to foreclose because they borrowed this money they couldn't afford, and the economy is still stagnant from that. Like the housing market really hasn't recovered from that. It's really hard to get a loan now for a home, very difficult, and so there's all these regulations, the banking industry trying to put back from that, but that's a bubble. And so the South Sea bubble in 1720, 1719, the British government had given the South Sea Company rights to take over the national debt. They'd been given that monopoly on the slave trade with Latin America a few years earlier that we talked about, and they would presumably make a profit from the interest collected from the government on the debt. And so everyone's really excited about this, and so everyone starts to buy stocks in it until someone realizes, like, whoa, like, the stocks are worth 580 million, but our assets, all of the ships, all of the slaves are only worth 400 million. So the people inside the company go, oh, we need to start to sell and get out before people realize. And so when the investors start to sell, it creates the bubble bursting. Okay, so after, you know, they drove the stock prices higher and higher, and then they start to sell, the bubble bursts and results in the first large-scale financial crash. And then the Mississippi bubble is going to do the same thing, but with the French, and that's that national debt that we talked about that will remain staggering and play a role in the French Revolution 7 decades later. So this is the economy behind the scenes. It's going to hurt both Britain and France. And then on top of that, we have some wars really fast to go over, which are going to play a part in the economies here, especially the continued decrease in France at this time. So really fast, we're going to go back through all the wars we've covered that have to do with the 18th century economy. So the colonial wars could be considered part of the Second Hundred Years' War. We've discussed that, 1689 to 1815. Background, Britain and France, we know, were the two main adversaries in the colonial wars for the empire. So we have, you know, the need for these colonies to help support the mother nation. Between 1701 and 1783, both countries engaged in a series of war over the issue of maritime trade and colonial expansion. We saw the Netherlands and Spain at this time period are in relative decline. Of course, we talked about the Netherlands are going to do okay with banking industry, and then Spain's going to pop up once in a while, but really on the decline. In effect, these wars were world wars. They started on the continent, but we saw them spread over here, especially in the colonies. That they involved fighting in Europe, the high seas, and the New World. The Wars of Spanish Succession we've also discussed with the Wars of Louis XIV. With the prospect of the Bourbons controlling both Spain and France, and their empires became a threat to Britain in North America and the balance of power in Europe. The most important thing you just need to remember here is that Treaty of Utrecht, because France is going to lose Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay territory to Great Britain. So the start of France's retreat in the New World. Spain lost the Asiento to Britain. the West African slave trade with the New World, so that's why we're seeing half the slaves coming with the British in this time period. And Spain agreed to allow one British ship of merchandise per year through Panama. Now, this seems like a little thing with the Treaty of Utrecht, and we touched on it briefly, but it's really going to cause some more significant problems, which I'm going to introduce here, kind of set some background knowledge. So we have the Asiento, so the British can have as many ships with slaves as they want, but they can have one ship of merchandise. Okay, one ship of merchandise per year through Panama. This was Britain's attempt. They sneaked this in the Treaty of Utrecht to crack open the Spanish colonial market to British goods. This is going to create tension, however, because Spain really kind of conned into this clause in the treaty is always going to be wondering, does that British ship have slaves on it, which is allowed, or does it have goods? And this is going to create this Anglo-Spanish tension that is only compounded by a war over Gibraltar that had been taken in the Treaty of Utrecht, so they're still fighting over that. And so in 1729, this ends in another treaty, nameless. The only thing you really know about it is what Spain adds to this treaty, because there's still really some tension about, I think the British might be fudging a little bit. They're probably taking for all of these ships full of goods, not slaves. And so this treaty allows Spain to board British ships to see if they are smuggling. And so this will cause the War of Jenkins' Ear, which a lot of students always think I made that name up if it's an option on multiple choice, but it is an actual war, and starts over the issue of Spain's allegation of British abuse regarding the Treaty of Utrecht provision that allowed Britain to send one ship of merchandise to Central America per year. And so what happens is a provision of this new 1729 treaty is Spanish officials, as is noted in the treaty, board a British ship suspected of smuggling goods, not slaves, but goods, because it's more than their one ship, into Latin America, and turmoil ensues, and the captain of the Spanish ship cuts off the captain's ear of the British ship. His name is Captain Jenkins. And Jenkins is going to take a jar of brandy. I don't know what you do with your ear if it's cut off, but I guess I don't know, preserve it in brandy. And when he finally makes it back to Parliament 7 years later after his service, he takes his ear in the jar of brandy, takes it to Parliament, and in response, King George II went to war with Spain over this, this tension that they've had about this provision in the Treaty of Utrecht. And this conflict is going to expand into the War of Austrian Succession in 1740. So the War of Jenkins' Ear is this weird interim between the Treaty of Utrecht and then leads us into the War of Austrian Succession. And so the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 1748, which we've already talked about with the wars of Frederick the Great, involved battles between England and France in North America and India. Spain fought effectively in keeping its empire intact, while the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 essentially preserved the status quo in the colonial empires. But then that will lead us up to our 7 Years' War, or better known as the French and Indian War here in the colonies, that we previously discussed in the wars of Frederick the Great as well. So all of this ties together. All of this has to do, we're putting it in the context of the 18th century leading up to the Industrial Revolution. So we continue our dispute between England and France in the 7 Years' War. It's the biggest world war of the 18th century, and it began in the disputed Ohio Valley of North America when a young American officer who was sent to settle this dispute in Ohio Valley, George Washington, will then engage a French force protecting Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pittsburgh in 1754. The French forces and their American allies are then going to fight British and American colonial forces for control of North America. And this war becomes part of the larger 7 Years' War in Europe. So this is an extension of the 7 Years' War in Europe into the New World. Things will, take a shift when William Pitt, Britain's new prime minister, changes Britain's war strategy in the middle of the war by focusing more attention on North America. And this is where Britain's Royal Navy will defeat France's Navy in various engagement on the high sea. We're going to see that France's sugar trade with its West Indian colonies will be choked off, and Britain will take control of the French post near Calcutta, Madras, and India. So India becoming important to Britain. Spain enters the war on France's side, unfortunately, and then Britain will seize Cuba and the Philippines from Spain. But what's really important here is you need to know the key date, the Treaty of Paris, 1763, ends the 7 Years' War. Most important European peace treaty since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We've already covered all. And why it's so important is that France was completely removed from North America. You should have seen this map on your final. We've talked about this before. France lost Canada to Britain as well as its colonial possessions east of the Mississippi River. As compensation for Spain's support in the war, France gave Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans, to Spain. France had to accept British domination in India, especially Bengal, although it was allowed to keep its post there. This later proved significant as India will then become the, I think you've probably heard of it, is the jewel in England's crown and its most important colonial possession, as we're going to see the American Revolution coming up here. Next in your note, Spain will cede Florida to Britain in return for Cuba and the Philippines. Britain thus became the world's dominant colonial empire, and that's really the significance of all of this and where we're heading with Great Britain in the Industrial Revolution. So next in your notes, you see the American Revolution. We're not going to go into specific detail here. We talked about it a little bit before the French Revolution as a result of the Treaty of Paris. It's a big blow to the British Empire, although they'll still have India, but we're going to see them turn their attention towards home and having to produce all of these things at home. Voila, the Industrial Revolution. You can read through that part. Let's talk, though, a little bit about colonial Latin America. We've covered this before, too, but just a little review. So Spain kind of pops in and out. We've seen them hurt. We've seen them kind of all over the place. But in the 18th century, how it's relevant to us is a colonial Latin America up to Mexico. In the 18th century, Spain's colonies remained an important part of the Atlantic economy. We still have silver mining recovered in Mexico and Peru. They're going to revive a little bit because of the Bourbons. If you remember, we talked about the Spanish Empire had recovered under the reign of Philippe V, Louis XIV's grandson, Philippe Anjou, that we saw, take over with that appointment by Charles. Its navy became the third most powerful in the world behind Britain and France, so a little bit of recovery. After the War of Spanish Succession, Spain is going to improve its control over the empire through its enlightened despotism of Charles III, expanding economic and administrative reforms that we talked about. What needs to be noted, and it still has a modern-day impact, we've discussed before, is the hierarchy that is created in the New World or colonial Latin Empire. So at the top of it, you have the Spaniards, the people who came directly from Spain, and then right below them, you have the Creoles, who are Spaniards. They're just the same as the Spaniards, except they were born in Latin America, so they're lesser just because their birth happened in the colonial Latin Empire. They came to rival the power of Spanish authorities. Then below that, you have our mestizos, which were children born to Spanish fathers and Indian mothers. That will eventually be about 30% of the population. Then below them, you have Amerindian population constituting about 70%. But black slavery will remain in the sugar plantations of Cuba and Puerto Rico, not so much in the rest of the colonial Latin American empire. And then our total difference will be Portuguese, Brazil. Remember, Portuguese really only got to hang on to Brazil, but they're much more blended because of the number of slaves and the Portuguese, Indian, and African populations kind of blending together. So you won't see the hierarchy there. And so really that covers our 18th century economy and society up to the prep for the Industrial Revolution, a recap of the wars, a recap of economy, an introduction to the Agricultural Revolution and the Proto-Industrialization age. I have typed up in here Life in the 18th Century, which you should have gotten a glimpse at in Merriman in your last assigned reading. You can read through this on your own. It's very straightforward. It shouldn't need any explanation from me or take any more of your time on this video. Just make sure that you have covered it, that you have read through it, that you understand it, that you don't have any questions for me. We've covered pieces of all of it, and it's, like I said, very typed up. It's got some examples of neoclassicism in there that we've talked about. Of course, you'll see Mozart, which we have talked about and seen, and then look at the back at your terms to know and make sure that you have looked at your essential questions or essay questions, and we will pick up with the Industrial Revolution upon our return second semester. So Happy New Year. I'll see you next year. Don't forget to read Chapter 14 in Merriman.